John Harris wrapped his hands around a mug of lukewarm coffee, his eyes drifting from the ticking clock on the mantel to the quiet suburban street outside. At 50 years old, he had settled into a routine so predictable that each day felt more like a rerun of the last. There was a hollow in his life, a feeling that he was slowly becoming invisible in his own world. But today, as he glanced out the living room window, he noticed something different. A moving truck pulled up next door, which was unusual in itself. Maple Drive wasn't exactly a hotspot for newcomers. Curiosity sharpened his gaze as he watched the movers unload strange, shimmering furniture and peculiar orbs that seemed to give off a faint, otherworldly glow. Then she stepped out of the truck, and John felt his breath catch. The new neighbor was tall, her frame graceful yet slightly elongated in a way that felt both captivating and unsettling. Her skin glistened in the sunlight with a soft glow, making her appear as though she were made of stardust. But it was her eyes, deep, mesmerizing violet, that held him in place as she glanced around. Her gaze momentarily caught his through the window. John ducked behind the curtain, his heart pounding with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. Trying to shake off his nerves, he decided to step outside, pretending to busy himself with the rose bushes he'd been meaning to prune. As he clipped a few branches, he kept an eye on the woman next door. Finally, she seemed to notice him. Her face lit up with a warm, enigmatic smile as she approached. "Hello, neighbor," she greeted, her voice soft but with a musical quality that felt foreign yet comforting. "I am Tay. I hope I'm not disturbing anyone with my arrival." John struggled for a moment to find his voice. "Oh no, not at all. Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm John," he said, extending a slightly shaky hand. When she took it, he felt a strange tingling sensation travel up his arm, leaving him feeling flustered and a bit lightheaded. Tay held his gaze, and her violet eyes crinkled with a hint of amusement. "Thank you, John. I think I'll enjoy it here." There was something about the way she said his name that lingered in his mind, even after she'd returned to her house. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the image of her. Her otherworldly glow, her curious smile, the way her presence seemed to fill the air with an unfamiliar warmth. A strange curiosity stirred in him, one he hadn't felt in years. Over the next few days, John found himself glancing toward Tay's house more often than he cared to admit. She was an unusual presence on Maple Drive, a street where even the faintest gossip could last for months. And yet, she had a way of blending into the neighborhood while still standing out, as though she were part of another world entirely. One afternoon, while tending to his roses, he noticed her standing on her porch, watching him with a faint smile. Moments later, she approached him, her movements fluid and almost hypnotic. "Your flowers are beautiful," she said, her voice like a gentle melody that seemed to carry on the breeze. "On my home planet, we have flowers that sing when they bloom." John blinked, trying to decide if she was serious. "That sounds amazing," he replied, unable to hide his fascination. Tay nodded. A thoughtful expression crossed her face. "Perhaps I could show you sometime. It's something quite special." A flicker of excitement ignited in John's chest, mixed with a trace of uncertainty. "Yes, I'd like that," he said, the words escaping before he had fully processed them. She stepped closer, her violet eyes shimmering with an intensity he couldn't quite place. "I look forward to it," she murmured, brushing her hand against his arm as she passed. A warm, tingling sensation spread from where her hand had touched him, lingering long after she had gone back inside. That feeling stayed with him throughout the day, a strange thrill he hadn't felt in years. It was as though Tiny's presence had awakened something inside him, something he had nearly forgotten. But as the days passed, that thrill was gradually accompanied by a sense of unease. Tiny had a mysterious allure, yes, but there was something else. Something subtle beneath her warmth. She would wave at him over the fence, start brief conversations, and each time he was left feeling both intrigued and unsettled. When he asked where she was from, her answers were always vague, hinting at a distant world but revealing very little. John found himself drawn to her, yet each interaction raised more questions than answers. Why did her skin glow the way it did? What did she mean by singing flowers? A part of him sensed he was on the edge of something far beyond his understanding, and he couldn't decide whether he should step forward or turn back. One evening, Tiny approached him with a different energy. Her gaze was soft but serious, and she hesitated as if carefully choosing her words. "On my planet, it's a special season, a time for bonding," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes held his with an intensity that felt strange and unreadable. John felt a thrill, mixed with a creeping sense of apprehension. Most importantly, he wondered, was he ready to cross into a world so different from his own? Tiny's presence had taken hold of John's thoughts more firmly than he wanted to admit. She was magnetic, an energy in her that felt both familiar and utterly alien. Each encounter left him with a mix of emotions: excitement, curiosity, and a growing sense of something he couldn't quite name. Her vague answers about her origins and her reference to the bonding season lingered in his mind, stirring questions he had never considered before. A few days after their last conversation, John was startled when he heard a soft knock on his door one evening. Opening it, he found Tiny standing there, her violet eyes glimmering in the dim light. She wore a faint, mysterious smile that made his pulse quicken. "I wanted to invite you over," she said, her voice carrying a gentle warmth. "For a cultural exchange." Caught off guard but too intrigued to refuse, John nodded and followed her next door. Stepping into her home, he realized he had only seen glimpses from his window but hadn't fully grasped the extent of its strangeness. The space was a blend of the familiar and the alien, ordinary furniture mixed with glowing orbs that floated near the ceiling, shifting colors and casting a soft, otherworldly light. There was a faint hum in the air, as if the entire house were gently vibrating with some invisible energy. She led him to a peculiar-looking table with transparent edges that seemed to ripple like water, and they sat across from each other. Tiny poured a shimmering liquid from a decanter into 2 crystal glasses, handing one to him. "This is a traditional drink from my world," she explained, watching him closely. "It eases the mind and heightens awareness." John hesitated, then took a cautious sip. The drink was warm and slightly effervescent, sending a pleasant tingling sensation down his throat. As he continued drinking, he felt a wave of calm wash over him, his usual nerves fading into a gentle haze. The strange ambience of her home and the soft glow of her skin felt less foreign and more entrancing with each passing second. They began to talk, and for the first time, Tiny opened up about her home planet, a place filled with bioluminescent forests, rivers that sang when they flowed, and a society built on strong emotional connections. She spoke of her culture's emphasis on bonds, and though her words were still somewhat vague, John felt himself being pulled deeper into her world. Her voice was soothing, and each story captured his attention, easing his unease. At one point, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. An electric thrill shot up his arm, and he had to catch his breath. Her touch was unlike anything he had ever felt. Anything he'd felt before seemed as if her energy were fusing with his. Tiny's violet eyes held a glint of mischief in them. "My people have a season, a time when we seek a partner," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "And that time is now." John's heart raced, a mixture of shock and intrigue coursing through him. "You're here for that?" "Yes," she replied, her gaze steady. "But it's not simply a biological urge. It's a time when we form lasting bonds, share energy, and connect in ways that go beyond what most humans experience." Her words hung in the air, both thrilling and daunting. He couldn't ignore the primal curiosity awakening inside him. But a voice in his head urged caution. This was all unknown territory. What would it mean for him, for his carefully structured life? Yet he knew he couldn't simply walk away. A part of him needed to know what it would be like to cross that line. Seeing the uncertainty on his face, Tiny leaned closer, her hand lingering on his. "I understand if you're hesitant," she said. "I can feel the pull between us, but only you can decide whether you're ready to explore this." Her voice was gentle, reassuring, but the intensity in her gaze told him this was more than a casual invitation. She was offering him something deeply significant, a choice that could change his life in ways he couldn't fully understand. For the rest of the evening, their conversation moved between stories of her world and tentative questions about the bonding season. With each answer, she revealed more about her species' energy, how it would manifest when shared with a partner, and how it could heal emotions, perceptions, and even the inner turmoil. She explained it with a reverence that made it sound like a spiritual connection, one that both excited and unnerved him. As he left her home that night, his mind buzzed with the implications of what she had offered. He felt as if he were on the edge of something vast and unknown, and the idea both thrilled and terrified him. He couldn't deny the allure, nor could he escape the nagging questions about the consequences. Over the next few days, Tiny's influence seemed to ripple through his life in strange ways. He noticed changes around his home. Plants in his garden seemed to grow more vibrantly, and the air carried an unusual warmth. Even his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, remarked on how odd things felt whenever Tiny was near, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. John knew it was Tiny's energy, her very presence subtly affecting the environment around her. The line between the ordinary and the extraordinary had become blurred, and John felt himself slipping further into her orbit. As much as he wanted to stay grounded in his cautious, predictable life, a part of him knew that if he walked away, he would forever wonder what might have happened. One evening, as he tended to his roses, Tiny approached him at the fence. Her face was framed by the soft glow of twilight, and she looked more luminous than ever, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "John," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "there's something I must tell you. If I don't find a partner soon, the energy within me will grow unstable. It could be dangerous for me, and for anyone close to me." John felt a chill run through him, realizing this wasn't merely a romantic invitation. It was a plea, one that carried a risk he hadn't fully understood before. He swallowed, his mind racing. "What happens if you don't bond?" he asked, his voice tight with both fear and concern. Tiny's expression was serious, a shadow of worry crossing her face. "Our energy must be shared and balanced, or it becomes volatile. This season amplifies that need. Without a partner, I cannot control it." The gravity of her words sank in, and John felt the weight of the choice before him. He could refuse, return to the safety of his predictable life, or he could take the risk and step into her world with all the uncertainty and potential danger that it entailed. That night, John lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind churning with the thoughts of what Tanai had shared. He could almost feel her energy lingering on his skin where she had touched him, a sensation that made his heart race, even as it brought a sense of calm. By morning, after a restless night wrestling with his thoughts, John had made up his mind. The idea of bonding with Tanai, of entering into her world, both beautiful and mysterious, filled him with equal parts excitement and fear. But the thought of her leaving, or her energy spiraling out of control, was something he couldn't bear. So that morning, he found himself standing at her doorstep, heart pounding, determined to help her in any way he could. When Tanai opened the door, her expression softened as she took in his determined face. "John," she murmured, her violet eyes reflecting a mix of relief and gratitude. "I want to help you," he said, his voice steady but betraying a hint of nervousness. "I'll be your partner. I'm ready." Her face broke into a smile, one that radiated warmth and joy. She guided him inside, and the moment the door closed behind them, John felt the air around him shift. It was as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. Tanai led him to the center of the room, where floating orbs glowed softly, their colors shifting in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The entire space was charged with a gentle energy, humming with anticipation. She took his hands, her fingers warm and soft in his, and looked into his eyes. "Are you sure, John?" she asked, her voice a whisper, almost reverent. "Once we begin, our bond will change us both in ways you might not yet understand." John nodded, feeling a strange and exhilarating mix of fear and excitement. "I'm sure," he replied, his voice steadier than he expected. With a gentle smile, Tanai began to hum softly, a melodic sound that seemed to vibrate through him, resonating with the energy around them. As their connection deepened, John felt a warm surge of power flow through their joined hands, filling him with an overwhelming sense of calm and belonging. It was as if his very soul were aligning with hers, and in that moment, he felt whole. As the bond between them solidified, waves of light radiated from their joined hands, filling the room with a brilliance that made him gasp. Outside, the entire neighborhood seemed to respond to the bond. The flowers in John's garden bloomed in vibrant, unearthly colors, casting a rainbow of hues across the yard. The air around the house thrummed with a gentle hum, as if nature itself recognized the connection being formed. But then, A sudden knock at the door shattered the moment. Startled, they turned to see Mrs. Peterson and a few other neighbors standing outside, their faces a mix of shock and bewilderment as they took in the display of lights and colors. "John, what's going on in there?" Mrs. Peterson demanded, her eyes wide as she glanced from him to the glowing orbs inside. Tanae's glow dimmed as her gaze flickered between John and the neighbors, a trace of worry crossing her face. John stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Peterson. Please, go home. We'll explain later," he reassured them, though he could see the skepticism in their eyes. One of the neighbors muttered about calling the authorities. Reaching for his phone, John felt panic rise within him, but Tanae placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, John," she whispered, her tone steady and comforting. "I can manage this." She stepped forward, addressing the neighbors with a serene expression. With a graceful wave of her hand, the glowing orbs dimmed to a gentle, soothing light, and the thrumming energy in the air softened, bringing an unexpected sense of calm to the gathering. The neighbors, still uneasy but somewhat pacified, exchanged hesitant glances before retreating back to their homes, murmuring among themselves. Once they were alone again, John felt a profound sense of relief. Mixed with awe, the bond they had formed had settled something inside him, filling him with a warm, steady light he couldn't quite describe. He looked at her, a hint of pride and gratitude in her gaze. "Thank you, John," she said softly. "I couldn't have done this without you." In the days that followed, John and Teenie fell into a rhythm that felt natural, as though their bond had unlocked a new depth in their connection. John found that he could sense Teenie's emotions, her presence a constant source of calm and inspiration. Her influence continued to touch his surroundings. Flowers that hadn't bloomed in years were now vibrant, and the air around his home carried a gentle warmth, as if imbued with her energy. Despite the harmony between them, John knew that challenges lay ahead. Curious neighbors, though pacified for now, continued to watch the house with wary eyes. Even Mrs. Peterson, who seemed to accept the changes with skeptical tolerance, couldn't resist occasional glances of suspicion whenever she saw Teenie or John outside. One evening, as they sat together on his porch watching the sunset, Teenie took his hand. Her touch was gentle, but John could feel the strength of their connection thrumming through his veins. "You've given me a reason to stay," Teenie murmured, her gaze warm and thoughtful. "More than just survival, I feel alive here with you." John looked at her, realizing that the emptiness he once felt had been replaced with a sense of purpose. "You've brought life back into my world, Teenie. I never expected this, but I'm grateful." They shared a quiet moment, the glow of Teenie's skin casting a gentle light over them as the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky. They talked of the future, acknowledging the inevitable challenges, but embracing the unknown together. With Teenie by his side, John felt his life was no longer confined to routine or predictability. He had crossed a threshold into a new chapter, one filled with mystery, love, and adventure beyond anything he had ever imagined. As they sat together, hand in hand, John knew he had found his place in a world far bigger and more wondrous than he had ever dreamed. As the stars shimmered above them and the gentle hum of Teenie's energy surrounded them, John felt a deep peace settle within him. His life had transformed into an adventure, and he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that with Teenie, he had found not only a partner, but a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. End of story.